All right. Well, anyway, thank you all for letting me participate. The issue of forced labor has been an issue that's been keeping pretty much everyone at my firm busy nonstop for the last few months. It's a very fast-moving issue. It's driven totally by outsiders to the political process, including non-governmental organizations who are filing complaints. It's creating lots of enforcement issues, and quite frankly, for the people in any business that imports something with cotton. And it doesn't matter if it's the textile business, it could be the auto seat, you could be importing auto seats. If it has 0.1% of cotton, it could be impacted. It's triggering delays, seizures, penalties, and quite frankly, reputational harm. I'm not going to go through the whole legal structure other than to point out the key language is that any product, wholly or in part means just what it says. 0.1% is in part. And so if it's made by convict labor, forced labor, indentured labor, you have a potential problem. Now, wholly or in part could be at any level in the supply chain. It could be the finished goods. It could be the fabric. It could be the yarn. It could be the raw materials. There are several different ways that these play out, but the most important one with customs are the withhold release orders, or WROs. I think the most important thing that anyone in compliance needs to understand is that the legal standard is very low. The legal standard is if the commissioner finds information reasonably, but not conclusively. So the standard is somebody has a hint that there might be a problem. There might have been a social media posting about something. That's enough to stop goods. And what we have seen stopped runs the gamut of goods from, particular provinces in China to American and Australian and Brazilian cotton. But the legal standard is when the commissioner finds this, the port director must withhold release. Now, actually, before I get to findings, let me say that customs is required to, and they're very big on pushing that you may export the goods up front. And the reason that they're pushing that, number one, they won't have to go through the arduous process that these goods that one would have to go through to try to petition to release goods. When customs talks to it, I mean, they emphasize a lot about export, export, export. We've had clients who have been willing to export. We've had other clients who are like, I have 3 containers here. If I don't deliver these 3 containers, I can't deliver the other 30 containers that I've already brought in. And so we've had, this has been a mixed bag. Over and above with WROs, customs could make a finding, and that's if they specifically find that merchandise of a class or kind is violating one of these prohibitions, then they will publish a finding, and those goods must not enter the U.S. To make it easier, and I'll provide this afterwards to whomever wants it, but there's a whole list of findings. Here are some examples. While we see a lot of textiles recently, there are other things. There's everything from computer parts to hair products to tomatoes and downstream products from tomatoes. So I guess that means tomato sauce. There are other ones floating around about seafood, palm oil, which is a biggie at the moment. and disposable gloves. One of the more recent findings had to do with stevia. You know, I would be remiss if I didn't say that the whole context of this, really, if you look at the immediate issue, it actually goes back any number of years. And we saw rugs from certain countries. We saw other bits. We saw other small orders. Never a great one. Several years ago, we saw labor from North Korea, and that was kind of the starting point of the current reviews that we're seeing. And in fact, the questionnaires that customs are still using still reference North Korean labor. You know, I guess if you have a good questionnaire, don't bother updating it. You know, at the moment, for me, the greatest concern is cotton and cotton products from Xinjiang region. Let me say that Xinjiang produces 80% of all of China's cotton. So it is highly probable that any factory that worked with cotton in China, it's highly likely that at some point or other, historically, they had cotton from the Xinjiang region. Customs is also looking at labor, human labor, not just in the picking of the cotton, but in the production in each stream. When we started looking at cotton, the biggest concern was, you know, who picked the cotton from the ground? And can you document the picking of the cotton? In recent times, this is a moving target over the last, I want to say the last 30 to 60 days, has been not only was the cotton sourced from somewhere appropriate, but at each level of production, was there forced labor used in that? I will tell you that for a number of our clients, we put in submissions where, you know, the cotton came from the United States or the cotton came from Brazil, Australia. And despite that, you know, we got pushback because what we didn't document at that moment in time, that was 60 days ago, was that, you know, in the spinning of the cotton, forced labor wasn't used. So today, even from the time that I started looking at this issue in more depth over the last few months, the standards have just been evolving. So having said that, I thought I would give you customs process map. This customs may receive some allegations, or they can self-initiate a case. Customs will determine whether or not a WRO should be granted, and the commissioner can approve that WRO. What that means to an importer is that if those goods come in, they will be subject to detention. And you are given the opportunity to either export it, to contest it, or protest it. Let me say that you can file a submission to contest it, which is not a protest, or you can file a protest. What I have to tell people to be very careful about is that you can contest the decision, and that stays confidential, or at least it's not made public. If you protest the decision, the detention of the merchandise or the exclusion of the merchandise specifically, then the decision is made public. What we have seen recently was, you know, one or two decisions there really are only one or two published decisions. And then there were some that, you know, customs inappropriately published and pulled back because they shouldn't have been published. What they published was really the standard to which they're discussing. There was nothing secret about it, but they published on the Cross website, pretty much the standards that you need to you need to know where the cotton is from, and you need to know that forced labor wasn't used in every step. What we have found in any number of these cases where we have early on focused on just the source of the cotton rather than the whole production cycle was that customs at the end will say, yes, we agree, you've wallpapered to death the fact that the cotton is from the United States, but to the extent that we don't know you haven't proved to us that the negative, we'll let you export it later, but we can't, but we're not going to release it. The interesting thing is that we've had any number that have been released, but I think the test is becoming harder and harder. I think some of the newer political developments there is the reintroduction of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The Uyghurs are the Muslim minority in Xinjiang province, and they are they sort of were the focus of this whole, of the whole original issue here. What the Forced Labor Prevention Act would do is change that low standard from we need to know, we need to have we have a low threshold of knowledge to just the opposite, and make it a rebuttable presumption that it's made with forced labor unless you can prove to us at each and every level of production that it's not made with forced labor. And obviously, that a strategy for enforcement will continue to evolve. Again, the Human Rights Policy Act, and again, all of these things are bits and pieces that flow into this. I think that the most interesting one is the July 2020 U.S. Treasury publication of parties and making, the sanction prohibits U.S. firms from doing business, including financial transactions with the entities. Additionally, in that same time period, Customs created an interagency working group. And Customs is very proud of, Customs and the administration is very proud of this. And they're working together. It's Homeland Security, State, Treasury, to really try an answer. But like everything else, if you're working with Customs, Customs is the gatekeeper. So they're the ones who you have to prove. The interagency working group is like the ivory tower. Think of Customs as the toll collector below that ivory tower. I would also note that we are seeing, in addition to the goods being stopped, we are seeing importers, large and small, who do import, especially textiles from China, getting surveys. For those of you who have not seen the surveys, you should take a look at them. That's kind of a good tool as a starting point to understand what Customs is looking at in your supply chain. I will tell you that most of the people that we share the Customs survey with look horrified. They can't get past the second question. And it's really not that long a survey, but it's several pages of questions, but it's really looking to data that drills down in the supply chain all the way to places which most importers don't have. I mean, from my vantage point, what I see are a lot of importers who have really good handle, quality control in a factory, in a production factory. They may even know the source of the fabric. but they really don't know where their supply chain leads before that. Who's dyeing the fabric? Who's making the gray goods? Who's created the fabric? So I suppose the question is, what does a forced labor audit or detention look like? It is extraordinarily detailed. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents, but it is not hundreds of pages of documents to which you just slap together and hand them to the government. You need to tell a story. That story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You need to understand, from the cotton was picked here. These were the 7 people who picked the cotton. Here's the wages these people were paid. They're not forced labor. And you need to do that every step of the transaction. And customs, unlike many other things like free trade agreements where, they may ask you for 5 entries. They'll say, you know what, we'll do 1 or 2 and then let all of them ride. In the case of forced labor, our experience has been every entry stands on its own. Bottom line is, we will need to map the supply chain. You need to map it. You need to understand each level of the manufacturing process, from the picking all the way to the end. Remember that if goods are here and you're contesting it, those sit while the review is undertaken. We did begin to see releases in December and January of last year, but I will also tell you that at the moment, we're seeing more situations where things are being held. The review, we give lots of documents. I'm not going to walk through this, but these are some examples of the different types of documents we give for each level of production. I think that the piece that is really important, I'm going to go back to this list for 1 second, just to say, this is what you have to collect. Then the question is, what is customs doing with it? Understand that there are multiple steps. Those steps start at the local C, the Center for Excellence, nice word for what used to be called the import specialist team. The C reviews, it goes to their council, it comes back, it gets packaged, it moves to council, the next level up, and it works all its way to headquarters. In short, it touches at least 12 hands. Any one of those hands can kill the shipment. I would say the due diligence here is similar, but not the same. I mean, for those of you who are old enough to remember quota, this is very similar to quota, except that quota, we only needed to show production. We didn't need to show where the cotton came from. We only need to show that the origin conferring step happened in country X. But we can look, people who are in this area look to FTA verification, CTPAT, and other conflicts minerals. And the due diligence requirements I'm going to leave are going to be the same, whether we're talking about the corporate level, the factory level, all the way to the yarn and the raw cotton. I suppose I'm gonna stop here because I think that this is a great place to segue to Mark. What I've said is you got to collect a lot of information, and the question is, how do you collect the information? And with that, I'd like to turn this over to you, Mark.
Mark is now the host, and you should be able to share your screen now.
Yes, I will. So Richard, thank you very much for giving it from that aspect, the legal side. I come at it from a different angle. I've been working in technology for 20 years. Before that, I was in apparel manufacturing. I own my own knitting mills, my dye houses, factories here, Mexico, Colombia. I also imported a lot of products, so I understand the whole process. I'm also on the board of the American Apparel Association, NRF, a lot of these orgs that are focused on supply chain. So before I jump into it, how many people understand like what's going on with the Uyghur situation, how this is spreading, not just to apparel, but to tomatoes, like we heard. It's also affecting polysilicon, which is the primary ingredient in solar panels. And about 50% of the world's polysilicon comes out of Xinjiang. There's an issue there. It also affects the screws that go into Lenovo laptops. So it's pretty widely spread. How many people have a good understanding of how we've gotten to this place in Xinjiang?
Mark, we also have seafood now, which is
Yes, I know, coming out of that port, that one location. So it's funny, I've been dealing with, and I'll go through a little overview, but I've been dealing with leadership at some of the largest fashion brands globally. And for the first 3 months, I had to educate them on this situation. So let me run through, and I'll do it quickly. But what's happened here, let me just share this. So we have a platform, and it's a cloud platform. And what we do is track and trace for traceability, but we also use that for sustainability. So capturing carbon metrics, greenhouse gases, water usage, and then coming up with LCAs, which is a life cycle assessment. What is the environmental impact of each product? And then how does that roll up to the environmental impact of my supply chain? And how does that flow not only from the social aspect, but also from the environmental aspect and focus on ESG. So I'm not going to get into all of that today, but that's really where we're going with this. So does everybody see my screen?
Is that traceability and
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's talk about what's happening. A little bit about us. We've been in business for 40 years. We focus on the supply chain, tracking and planning how supply chain strategies get executed. We have over 1,000 customers in 80 countries. One of our big verticals is food and beverage. So the difference between food and beverage and most of these other industries is that the FDA has put laws in place that you have to track all of those components because of recalls. And if you eat a bad product, it could kill you. If you put on a shirt, even though it was made with forced labor, it's not going to kill you. So there hasn't been as much government participation in our supply chains until now. This is a list of some of our customers. So you can see we're dealing with PVH, which is Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger, Heritage Brands, Lacoste, mostly in Europe, Patagonia, Foot Locker. So these are companies that are really focused on this. They're also big importers into the US. So the tool that we built helps them provide proof of admissibility. So what's happened is that there are a Muslim minority called Uyghurs. They're based mostly in Northwest China. And the government of China has started repressing them, moving them into forced labor camps, into prison camps. Think of, I mean, it's even been connotated that this is genocide. So anytime you think of genocide, people think back to Nazi Germany. So that's kind of what's happening now. People are looking to see how are they getting their products made without forced labor. So in cotton, there's almost 600,000 Uyghurs working in cotton farms. So that's why any cotton coming from that region is no longer allowed in any product. And by the way, it's not just cotton products coming from China, because this region, Xinjiang, supplies 20% of the world's cotton. So there are other countries that use cotton from China that import to the US, like Vietnam, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, the Philippines. So pretty soon, Richard, I'm sure you know this, you're going to start seeing detainments from other countries besides China because they can't prove that that cotton doesn't come from there.
Actually, we have seen, we've already had them from Bangladesh and from
Okay.
Vietnam.
Okay. Now, Xinjiang also accounts for 70% of China's tomatoes. And China accounts for 40% of the world's tomato paste. That's why the latest WRO is for those two products. you might start seeing that expand. Also, you know that Congress has been going through passing bills that passed in the House in September. Senate was going to vote on it, but then our politics got in the way. So CBP decided to just preempt all of that. And they put these WROs in place, which basically enforces the law before the law even exists. So right now, any product coming in has to have traceability. So what our solution does, it manages, and again, it's in the cloud, all the suppliers, every tier, all the purchase orders and the shipments are in the platform. We then record a paper trail. So that chain of custody, that's what Customs is looking for, from cotton source to the importer of record. And the Uniqlo detainment and the subsequent petition, to me, was a landmark case, because there are tools out there such as Oratane. It's a genetic test where you can analyze the cotton and determine based on its isotopes where that cotton was grown. But in the case of Uniqlo, it came from Brazil, Australia, and the US, and they could prove that. But what they couldn't prove is that all the downstream transformation, so spinning, ginning it, spinning it, knitting and dyeing into fabric, and then making garments, they didn't have that chain of custody. So right now, to me, the chain of custody is the only way to provide proof of admissibility. Once you have that, we collect all the supporting documents, we organize them by matching the PO, packing list, and invoice for that transaction. Also could do transportation documents, bill of lading. And rather than going out for every one of these transactions, collecting the wage slips and doing on-site audits, those I've seen come up as anomalies. So Customs might ask for wage slips on this case, but on the next case, they might not. We sequence those transactions and create a compliance certificate. This is the story that Richard was talking about, that starts in the beginning from the cotton source and works its way through and lists all of those suppliers and then links them together. And then it summarizes the chain of custody. And then those compliance certificates are being sent in and they're preempting the detainment, because we're sending them in with the shipping documents. So Customs has access to that. And I'll get into that in a little bit more. So what we see is that if you look at a schematic, over here on the right, we have CBP, and then we have the importer of record. So this would be a typical importer. It could be Patagonia, Nike, Under Armour, and they have the relationship with the tier 1 factory. That's where their POs are written. That's where their financial leverage is. And they also might know, and in many cases they do know, who is the mill supplying the fabric. But in most cases, they don't know who the yarn spinner is, where did the yarn come from, and they certainly don't know where the cotton came from. This is what we're tracing, and we call this a digital thread. So this is connecting all of those suppliers that we create the certificate for. And by doing this, we provide CBP with visibility to all the source documents, plus that compliance certificate. So within the compliance certificate, we're tracing every owner as it gets transformed. And what we see is that you have the importer, here's the tier 1 supplier producing the finished goods, who's supplying the materials, where is the ingredients or the yarn coming from, and then eventually down to the cotton supplier. And I'm pretty dialed in with CBP. As a matter of fact, I've submitted a proposal for them to adopt this solution for all imports coming into the US, because that way they could comprehensively get access to it. It would really streamline the process that you showed, Richard, where everybody would be able to go through an approval using digital documents. But really, when we're looking at proof of admissibility, you have to provide that chain of custody. And if not, there's 3 options. Like Richard said, the path of least resistance is exporting the products to a different country. So Uniqlo has an opportunity to send them elsewhere. So does most of the brands that we deal with, because they're global in nature. But what that means is that the customers and the stores that you were selling to here in the US aren't going to have their products. And if you don't have that global distribution, you're going to either abandon them or destroy them. Now, what is customs looking for is policies and evidence that you've implemented a solution or a process. They'd like to see some third-party audits. There haven't been many audits going on these days, especially with the pandemic, but they also want to know what your remediation plan is. What are you going to do if you do find one of your suppliers is utilizing forced labor? How are you going to exit them and identify any products that may have used some of their inputs? And then what we're doing here is building that supply chain map. So all the way from cotton source to importer, we're listing that out. So before I go forward, is there any questions? Because I kind of want to walk you through the thought process.
Yeah, hi, Mark, it's George. I do have a couple questions for you. And I just sent you one. What about sewing thread? What about pocketing material? What about the accessories that might be associated with the textile?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm sorry, go ahead. Do you have a second?
Oh, and then the other point was, I really love what you've done, and I've had a few of these cases and tried exactly what you did with regard to the traceability. That's what we did for the clients, but we had to rely on the client gathering the data on the supply chain and the documentations. We packaged that, gave it to customs, and they said no. And I'm assuming they said no because we didn't include the labor and all the documentation to show that the laborers were paid a quote fair wage, even though it was clear that the cotton didn't originate in the Uyghur area.
Right.
So I'm curious as to your success rate, if we can even tell yet, just on supplying this information, or if you have to go even further and do the site audits to get the labor materials. And maybe Richard can comment on this as well. Will they accept the supplier produced information, or do you really have to have a third party do that on-site audit to get that documentation?
So far, to the best of my knowledge, and I just got asked this question about 3 hours ago, none of our customers have had their goods detained. If they got pulled aside and they were able to look and go through the chain of custody document, the compliance certificate, I have yet to hear that any of our clients have had any detainments. Now,
That's
they might not have told me, but I have not been made aware of that.
Yeah, that's good. We weren't quite as successful.
Yeah.
Now,
Unfortunately, George, we've seen too many of these, and let me say that the companies have been both large and small, and we have been successful at some. We have a whole lot of them that are still in limbo, and we've had some where our worst case scenario has been they've not permitted entry, but they've allowed export because of the documentation issues.
Yeah.
But I will say that, in many cases we're reliant on the vendors, and most of our clients are reliant on their vendor, and their vendor is reliant on the next level in the supply chain. George, you're not getting on a plane and going to Xinjiang to count the bales of cotton. The same way you or I might have done, 25 years ago, to go to a production facility to determine if the origin was correct in a textile case. But I think that the standard, I think that the need for the documentation is there. Collecting it is really important, but it's up to the importer to make whatever, do whatever they can do. I can tell you that the inspection companies can't get in past perhaps the fabric maker. Maybe they can get to the maybe they can get to the dyeing mill, but that's pretty much it. I mean, so we're, you know, everybody is reliant on the people up the supply chain to have the leverage to continue in the supply chain. You know, it's very rare that you have vertically integrated. It's non-existent that you're vertically integrated from cotton to manufacturing.
So I agree with you, and I'll explain how our customers are doing it. But to answer the first part of your question, George, the digital thread isn't just a single thread, not just looking at the main fabric. And you're right. So there could be multiple digital threads for a single garment, and the system would allow for that. Because you might have one item that uses two materials from two different mills. You might have one fabric that's using different yarn lots that could come from different spinners who use different ginners. So just to keep it simple, I just make it go in a very linear fashion, but it's much more complicated than that. What our system does, though, is that right now our customers know who their tier 1 suppliers are. They have those suppliers, all the information is within the system. And now as we start to roll this out to tier 2 and beyond, as those suppliers are entered into the system, it's creating a new record. So what becomes important for our clients, they want to know who is the name of the supplier, what tier are they located in, and then what stage are they in. So within our solution, you can go through a whole onboarding process, do on-site audits, factory evaluations, collect all this data to do business with them. But a lot of times that's for the tier 1 suppliers, because you need to know, are they financially stable that you're going to continue to use them. But as they're entering this information, we're capturing all the information related to every supplier at every tier. And then as you go through the chain of custody, that's what links them all together. So we're building a hierarchy, and it could be a different hierarchy for different products, or even a different hierarchy for the same product if you're dual sourcing. So we're collecting all of this. And then because we capture their GPS location, we can put pins on the map and link those together. And right from here, I can drill into any one of these suppliers, see any of their status, what materials they're using, who they're doing business with within their sphere of influence. And then we also can collect all the compliance documents. So this is really a vendor onboarding tool that we've now created that links all of those tiers, where I might have business licenses, income statements, conflict minerals documents, CTPAT questionnaires, and that's maintained in the system. And then as we go through, the system will automatically identify where's their risk. So is there a supplier within their supply chain or digital thread that hasn't been entered or approved or vetted? And has any of them been publicly declared to be related to XPCC or have some type of affiliation? Then we need to know where that supplier exists within the supply chain, both up and down. Right now, what my customers are doing, they are not looking to track and trace every single purchase order they issue. They're really focused on cotton products coming from China. And that's going to expand to cotton products coming from elsewhere. But here I can see all of my POs. Here I can see all the verified transactions against those POs. And if I drill into it, I can then see this is the PO I issued to tier 1. Here's the fabric mills POs, yarn spinner, cotton source, and there could be as many tiers as necessary. If you're vertical, you might be doing vertical from yarn all the way to finished garment. You wouldn't have as many tiers. But if I have customers including ginners here, so even within the ginning, it seems in my discussions with CBP, they feel comfortable if you can trace from the ginner forward, because they're coming to understand that ginners are located in proximity to the cotton fields. You're not going to pick cotton in Xinjiang and ship raw cotton, unginned cotton to Shanghai. it's not worth the effort and the cost. So they're beginning to understand that. Then what we look at when we have the compliance certificate, here's just a blown up example. Here's the importer of record. So where did they buy their finished goods? Where did they fabric mill supply to the finished supplier? And then what are those financial transactions that verify that? And I can get into a million more levels of detail on this, but suffice it to say, this is what they're looking for chain of custody. And then rather than waiting for a shipment to be detained, we have our customers looking and doing workflow so that the minute that PO is issued, they already start collecting those documents. And they're relying on the tier 1 supplier to do most of the heavy lifting because they know where they bought their fabric. They have relationships with the mill to find out where the yarn was supplied and then working their way to the ginner. But the tier 1 is the one that has the most financial risk because our customers are working on net 60, net 90-day terms. And if the goods don't clear, they're not paying for them. So the tier 1 has taken the onus.
Do the importers have contractual limitations on payment? That's been a problem for my clients where, you know, that it passed this test is a condition upon payment. And then my next question would be, and that goes to the internal controls, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next question is, how long is this process taking you? Because if you're a small importer, you're probably not doing anything until you get a detention notice and a request for these documents.
Yeah, that's why, I mean, when you look at companies like PVH, they started rolling this out in January. So now all of their suppliers are doing this and submitting the compliance certificate and the associated paperwork with the shipment documents. They're not waiting to the end because, Richard, how long could it take from the time that you get notified of a detention until you start seeing those documents come in, if you see them all completely come in anyway?
Minimum 45 days.
Right. And then it takes how long for customs to walk through it?
Well, the bigger issue is that there's a 90-day period of
Window,
time,
right? Mhm.
and customs is taking the position, even though you have 90 days to present the documents, if you hand them on the 80th day and they're not finished with them on the 90th day, they're taking the position on the 90th day that they have to deny entry. And
Right.
so it's, you know, if you can't do it in 30 to 40 days, it's a ridiculous exercise because then you have to go through you have to protest the exclusion. And it's that's something, I mean, we've been trying to work with customs on that because there is no limitation, there should be no limitation on their side
Right.
to review the documents. We have a regulatory, you know, 90-day period, but they should not have such a period.
Right. And one of the reasons they reached out, so I started working with them and telling them what we were doing with this, and they're here. There's nothing left really for me to share except, you know, the ability to do KPIs against this. So let me just stop sharing for this.
Hey, Mark, I have a quick question. I just want to clarify something. Is your technology actually adding or augmenting any suppliers or intelligence, or are you really just taking the data right off of those commercial documents and organizing it into what you're calling that certificate?
Well, the issue is that's what we're doing now. So we're in the middle of a proof of concept where we built a blockchain that tracks from from cotton gin forward. And we're using, I mean, RFID would be optimal, but these ginners can't afford that. So we're using QR codes, we're using NFC chips. They use NFC chips right now in Brazil for all their bales. But we're building it going forward like we do for the FDA, because the FDA needs to be able, if there's a recall, they need to track it back to the point of failure and then recall any lots that might be affected. So we're in the midst of that right now. And then you start putting all of the AI into looking at anomalies. And there, again, I could talk about this all day long, but that becomes the critical issue. And if customs adopts the solution, they'll have all the data in one place where they can start seeing volumes coming in. They can start comparing one supplier to the next, what their yields are, where they're bringing goods in. And if you look at it just on a company by company basis, it's really opaque. Ralph Lauren could say, yes, my goods did this, but you know, a cotton mill could buy, you know, 100,000 kilos of yarn, which could get distributed over multiple products that go out to dozens of different suppliers, finished goods suppliers. So it becomes hard to manage and value that.
I have a question about the compliance certificate. When is that submitted to customs at time of entry? Can you do it through ACE?
They don't have the, I want them to, they don't have the ability to bring that in through ACE yet. That's one of the propositions that I'm promoting, where if they could bring it in through ACE. So right now it's created prior to shipment, and then it's going with the shipment paperwork, but not electronically.
It probably, Ashok, it's probably going in under DIS, which is the document imaging system that the brokers have to support the entry.
Right.
Thanks.
Mark, I have a question. Jim Dickerson here.
Sure.
What if suppliers, and I know Richard said that your tier one suppliers are severely influenced to help you out with this because that's how they're going to get paid. But what if a tier one supplier doesn't want to reveal their suppliers or further up the line? How is confidentiality of those other parties up the supply chain of their supply chain? How is that protected in the system?
So we've done a lot of research on this. The only thing that people are concerned about right now is the price. So they're showing the volumes, the purchase orders that were issued, but those aren't shared across what I would say competitors. So Nike doesn't know, here's how much of this fabric that Under Armour. So that's really insulated. It's the price that people are most concerned about. The yarn supplier doesn't want the fabric mill to know how much they're paying for cotton. The finished goods guy doesn't want the importer to know how much they're buying the fabric for, because then that becomes a price negotiation. So the one thing we're leaving off is the price of every component.
Yeah,
And
I see a situation where, they obviously don't want to reveal the price, but they probably don't want to reveal their source because then somebody might go around behind them directly to the source.
That's the, you're stuck then. That's why they exclude the merchandise rather than.
I don't think you have an option with that. You know, listen, if you're buying finished garments and the fabric mill, you have the right to ask your finished garment supplier who supplies the fabric. And in many cases, they're nominating them. And at the end of the day, does it really matter which spinner is supplying the yarn? They need to have that visibility, and it just doesn't exist at this point.
This is, I guess my next question would be for both you and Richard. What are you doing about the fact that, I mean, they may be sourcing materials from multiple suppliers. It's all going into inventory. How are you providing documentation for it going out of inventory and into production? How do you include that traceability?
Well, see, really, at the end of the day, there is consistency and visibility from one supplier to the next. So, you know, if you know about dyeing fabric, you have to cut products based upon a dye lot. Otherwise, you could get shading in the garment.
Right.
When you're spinning yarn, you want to have consistency of the cotton. Now, there is going to be combinations, and I kind of was alluding to that earlier, that there could be multiple dye lots that go into a production run.
Right.
But they're not typically going to come from different suppliers if it's meant to be the same fabrication, because you run a big risk of poor quality. Same thing with yarn. You're not going to try to start mixing yarns unless you're doing it intentionally. But we have the capability to track both of those suppliers that supplied multiple lots into a single lot as it gets transformed. So it does become complex.
Yeah,
Richard?
I have to say that where we've seen the toughest issue isn't even so much where you've had multiple suppliers. It's where a particular fabric is made out of a half a dozen or a dozen yarns. And so we've had, you would think it's a simple cotton garment, yet the yarns within it may come from a half a dozen or dozen suppliers. And so it's really 12 supply chains. It's not just one supply chain.
Absolutely. You're right.
And I think I'll just add my last comment on this because I see the chat as well. Someone asked about CBP. Have they expressed any concerns about the information, the truthfulness and the integrity of the information that's provided by the supplier? I think, again, I'm not going to hijack this and turn this into a plug for me, but I would say that what CBP is doing is they are looking at AI solutions that can help construct the supply chain beyond what that importer may even know. So by looking at the business registries and ownership data that's linked to these cross-border transactions, you can actually construct who's doing business with who and show an importer who their suppliers are that they may not ever know about, and using AI to build those connections. So where Logility looks like they do a really great job of taking data out of commercial documents and organizing it in a nice, easy to read fashion for purposes of facilitated admissibility, there are other solutions that are in the mix trying to also, help solve this problem by showing companies more than what they think they know about their own supply chain. And I think that's why this is a prime AI problem.
Yeah, I mean, we have AI and ML based in ours also, but really, this has to be at a federal level. So it has to be collecting data from all these sources into one data pool. You can't have 15 different companies using 15 different solutions and expect that all to come together. And that's where we really need to go. And it sounds like, Amy, that's kind of the direction that you guys are taking.
Yeah, I mean, like I said at the top when we were just chit-chatting, right? Like the way we started is we started by building this global map of the international supply chain using public and proprietary and bespoke data sources, and then using data fusion technology to link it all together into a map. And then you can start asking it questions. You can say, we've got our friend from Uniqlo here, right? You could like ask Uniqlo and like to see all their suppliers and then dig into their suppliers, and then and I think that's the kind of solution that'll be required. So yeah, we're not starting by building a supply chain around a company. It's rather we built the entire supply chain, and then now we can start asking it very targeted questions about certain sectors, regions, companies.
Richard, Jim here. I had a question, and I think Amy even put it in the chat box. Do you have an example of that survey that CBP has been sending out?
Oh, absolutely. Tomorrow, I'll be happy to send one tomorrow, and you can forward it to everybody.
Yeah, send it to me because I'm going to send everybody copies of their slides as well. Hopefully, yeah, send me your slides so I can have those, as well as the link to the recording. The other question I had for you, Richard, when the goods are detained, since you talked about a 90-day process, are these moved to like a geo warehouse or something? How do we avoid demurrage? Can we move it to a bonded facility?
That's a function of the port. We have goods that actually have sat on the pier while the whole process has taken place. Generally, you can't put it in a bonded warehouse unless you make something other than, you have to make an appropriate entry. If you enter it for consumption, you can't put it in a bonded warehouse.
What about a free trade zone? Because I know I've actually used free trade zones to satisfy an export requirement to close out a TIB or something.
That's correct, but that's not, but when the goods are sitting, waiting for release, they would stay in a container exam site.
But it would move to a free trade zone under an IT or something. And if they're going to re-export it, it's going to be on an IE. So what's the difference?
Not until customs permits you to do it. They're not going to permit you to do it until they make the decision as to the goods, unless you choose to export it immediately.
Okay.
You know, it depends on the status of the goods at all times.
Gotcha.
I have a question and a comment. This is Ashok Sadhwani. I'm from Los Angeles. 4 months of the year I spend in Thailand, Bangkok, and from the perspective of the fishing and the shrimp industry, there are requirements by the U.S. Customs where we have to provide supporting labor documents, like employees' work that produce the goods, time cards, wage payment receipts, process reports, and all of that. And as most of you all know, that kind of business in countries like Thailand, so labor intensive, not many of these companies have computers to work with. So it's all very manual. And they find it very difficult when people like us and customs want to get into their books and find out how they work. So that's my comment, because this is coming from Thailand, but not only in the fishing industry, the sugarcane industry, when they export sugar out, child labor is used in the sugarcane fields and some of the farms. So they don't have many records out there. And for us to ask them to bring records in, they shy away. So that's one comment I have. So the question again would be, how would we bring those kind of industries in countries like Thailand into compliance?
Well, let me make some comments, because there's no good answer to your question or to your point. Let me say that customs believes that everybody has records the same way as if you manufactured the goods in the United States. That's the fundamental belief, the fundamental practice. So let me take this out of the arena that we're talking about. Let's talk about free trade agreements for a moment. And I'm going to just arbitrarily talk about jewelry, because I tend to do jewelry cases. I don't know why they fall in my lap. But jewelry, in jewelry, gold jewelry, making gold chains, if it's in a country that's either GSP or subject to a free trade agreement, the legal standard is double substantial transformation. You have to prove that those things took place, that the article changed its identity twice, and you have to have all of these records to prove it. What we found is that there are certain countries that have this same program. So we have the jewelry from country A, and so a recent one into the arena of free trade is Oman. Now you would think, what's in Oman? There are caves in Oman that people manually work, and when you ask them for production records, their production records are, if they didn't pay him cash yesterday, they won't come back to work tomorrow. There is no record. The problem is that you're not going to support, you can't support your duty-free claim. And this is exactly the same thing. If you can't produce the records, you're not going to see the merchandise. I mean, this is not this is not rocket science. And it's very tough on some of our trading partners who are less developed. I'm not even going to touch the issue of child labor in there, because that's a different smoking gun. But it is clearly a situation that if you can't produce the records, it's not the right place to be doing this production, the specific production.
And anybody else have questions? I think I've
There you go.
managed to ask all mine. Yeah, thanks, Mark.
Yeah, I guess my question would be, there's some companies that work on doing internal audits for other related issues that are similar to this? Has anybody been successful in using those quality controls audit companies?
Yeah, there are quite a few of them, and I think that's one of the issues right now is that it seems like it's very fractured. So a lot of the companies that do it tend to be the testing companies, like Bureau Veritas, SGS is doing a lot of this right now. So they do that one facility at a time, and that's one of the things that our solution does is that whole onboarding process, managing that. So, like I said, there had been a lot of focus on tier 1. Now it rolled out to all the tiers, and that's where they're moving.
Is China blocking the use? I know we've had contact with SGS, and they have been unable to provide all of the traceability.
They are. They are, especially in Xinjiang. They just, they won't let any third-party auditors come in, and the third-party auditors are refusing to go there now. So yeah, it's an issue.
Mark, I have a quick question. My name is Toru. My company has been discussed a couple of times already during the call. So you can guess which company I belong to. So actually, well, we are trying to improve the traceability in our upstream supply chain because actually we didn't have a good experience with WLO in the past 6 months. So actually, Mark, I'm too much interested in the service that you're providing. And one of the questions that I have is that you have resources outside the United States, and those resources gonna work. I mean, yeah, that's my first question, because actually our headquarters is located outside the United States. So, yeah, if our headquarters were interested in working with your team, right? Actually, I'm based in LA, San Diego, right? But yeah, the majority of the conversation should be taking place between our headquarters in Tokyo or our sourcing offices across Asia. So I'm curious to know the resource allocations that you have.
I have offices all over the world. I would say our biggest implementations are being done out of Asia. So I mean, I would say the majority of the rollouts are taking place with like PVH's office, Under Armour's office, VF, through their sourcing offices, because those are the ones that really get involved. And even though I have relationships with the headquarters and the higher level, like chief supply chain officers, it really is rolling out because that's how we're going to implement it. So yeah, we absolutely can help you.
Okay, that's great to know. Is there somebody in Tokyo as well?
Yeah, we have people we have representation, I believe, in Tokyo. If not, I mean, I have them all over. I would have to find out. I'm really not involved in services. But Toru, I would be your contact. Please reach out to me. I run strategy and I run the industry vertical for fashion.
Yeah, I definitely will reach out to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have, if I can, I have another question for Richard. And this has to do with the submissions to customs. If you look at their website regarding this, they talk a lot about what kind of internal controls does the company have, what kind of agreements. Are you setting those up, Richard, with the textile companies, with the apparel companies, and submitting that to customs, or just sticking with the documentation?
Well, we put in whatever we can put in. Let's be honest here. If a company has good controls, that most of our clients who have controls set up the controls back in earlier days.
Right.
They weren't setting them up specifically for this problem. They were looking to avoid social compliance problems. They were looking to, in quota days, deal with, origin problems. And so we have continuously been setting up those types of programs. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, for whatever it's worth, the documents, that you have a program or good corporate policy is only going to buy you the first minute and a half in the conversation. You got about another 100 hours of documents that have to be reviewed and prepared. So I think that it's still about the documents. Everything else is from my point of view, window dressing. It's nice window dressing, but it's window dressing. And you really have to be able to, you're called to the task. Either you produce records or you can't produce records. And you can have the best program in the world, but if you can't produce records from that program, you're not gonna see the goods. At least that's been my experience. George, I wouldn't dare to talk about yours. Because I know you have a good associate, so.
He's doing well.
Richard, kind of a similar question to that. I know that forced labor is working its way into CTPAT. Have any importers' CTPAT status been impacted by their inability to support admissibility claims of forced labor?
Not that I'm aware of yet. Customs in its infinite wisdom takes years to do anything. And this is, as customs programs goes, this is really relatively new. So the standards are evolving. And remember, nobody's done a real CTPAT review, at least physically, for the last 2 years or a year and a half. So I don't really think that we're going to see, even that being the case, that anything's going to happen for at least a year minimum, unless something extraordinary happens in an isolated case where customs had a supply chain, they had vetted a particular vendor. But the truth is that CTPAT vetting really doesn't tell you where the cotton came from. It doesn't tell you what happened in the steps before. It only tells you that the supply chain, that the manufacture is taking place in a particular place, and they're putting it into a container in that particular place, and it's going to a secure carrier from that place. It doesn't really talk to what's happened earlier in the production cycle, which is what what the underlying issue is here.
Richard, Jim here. You mentioned that it's still evolving, and I as I've been thinking about this over the past several months, it reminds me of the amendments to the Lacey Act when those rolled out. Those were so onerous that it was seemingly impossible to fulfill, like what we're looking at now today with forced labor. And I think that they've actually sort of taken a step back on some of those requirements. So do you anticipate seeing any step back on some of the forced labor issues, like de minimis amounts or something? Or
absolutely not.
Yeah.
And the reason is this is a political hot potato. What official at customs is going to say it's all right to have child labor, slave labor, but only if it's worth under $800 or whatever the answer is? I mean, unfortunately, there is no de minimis. Now, it used to be there were exceptions to this, which is why this was sort of a dead issue for 25 years. If you couldn't get the product anywhere else, you ignored the fact that it happened to be forced labor. That's not true anymore. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find a congressman who doesn't want, a congressperson who's not going to respond to a constituent with this claim, and they're not certainly pressuring the customs to enforce.
Yeah, I think this goes along with their view of decoupling with China. They can do this, and they can make a whole lot of changes to how the U.S. handles its supply chain without going to duties. I mean, this is
right.
And indirectly, it's may cut off some of those foreign supply chains and maybe onshore more business.
Nah. I don't know of anybody that's going to U.S. businesses for other sources.
No, I mean, look,
Well, we have a long history of slave labor and cotton in this country, right?
Oh, don't bring that up.
Yeah, I know.
I don't know. You know, look, this is gonna, you know, this, just like the quote, just like tariffs and everything else, is designed for the ultimate result of not China. The result is not going to be made in USA. The result is going to be not China. And unfortunately, we have to remember, you know, there's a shortage of the world supply of cotton right now. Cotton is expensive wherever you get it from. The cotton from Jiangxing province is no more expensive. In fact, cotton from California is cheaper than cotton from China. The reason it ends up being more expensive is because you have to transport it. You know, this is not gonna go away. It's just going to move the supply chain around. But we have to remember that cotton in countries nearby, the Vietnams and Bangladeshs of the world, it's just as likely that cotton is going to be tainted in those places as it is from anywhere in China. We may not have to deal with the secondary issue of prove that every level of production is forced labor, but we still have to deal with the underlying issue of, you know, what's the source of the cotton and was it harvested with forced or slave labor?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that a lot of fabric is shipped to those countries. So you will have to trace it all the way back to the mill, you know, to the point that it gets exported from China. You'll have to show that there's no forced labor there.
So, you know, we'll go to the not China economy. That's really the, unfortunately, that's the answer. But the flip side of that is at least many of my clients don't have the capacity. They've spent many years building up infrastructure. They have the trained workers, they have great facilities, and they just can't move it. And quite frankly, the fact that it's really been a terrible evolution that you can buy U.S. cotton or buy Brazilian cotton, buy Australian cotton, bring it to China, and still have the same problems. Right. One would think that if you're bringing cotton from the United States, for example, you shouldn't be in this bucket. But, you know, in the past, any number of importers have been put in that bucket, even while taking these extraordinary means of getting, sourcing cotton from other places to avoid this.
Yeah, I mean, the other problem you have with China is that you have a lot of these companies that also do a huge retail business there. I mean, you look at H&M, you look at Nike, now all of a sudden they're getting blacklisted. I mean, you guys know all what happened with those. I mean, are they going to take a big chunk of their revenue because now they're not going to want to sell in China? So it's a double-edged sword.
Have we seen any trade statistics coming out of customs yet on the number of detentions that have been imposed versus released versus exported? I haven't seen anything, and I'm just wondering.
I haven't seen any. I have not yet seen any published statistics.
I heard last week that there have been over 500 detentions, but they haven't broken it out whether it was just cotton or is that including tomatoes. Has anybody heard of any tomato detentions? I have not heard of that.
I'm not aware of that. I will tell you that the Port of Los Angeles is sitting on 100 of them right now. At least that was what I was told the other day. Right. What part of the problem with the statistics is that I'm not clear if exports are being counted in or out. Right. It would seem to me, given the number of cases that we've had, And, I don't, we're not the bellwether, but, we have our share of them. The number has to be greater than 500 if you can, if you include the exports. And anything that's been
Awesome.
stopped plus the export,
Yeah.
including the exports, that number's got to be, triple or more.
Mm,
We also, the other question in the counting is, we have company X may have 5 containers coming in, 5 different entries coming in. Entry number 1 is what they stopped originally, but then they stopped the 5 behind it.
right.
And, so I'm not sure what they're counting or not counting. So, we actually had an inquiry into John Leonard's office about that, just so that we got a sense about it, but he conceded that he didn't have the data.
Richard, I do have a question. Let's say that an importer lands a container and only part of it gets detained. Do they release the balance of that container, or is that the entire shipment gets held?
No, if the container has merchandise of multiple varieties and one is questionable and there's the balance of it is not, it can be moved into a bonded warehouse.
Okay.
You can segregate it and you can make entry on the balance of the merchandise.
Got it.
That's easy and that's straightforward. But the question comes down to the economics of it, depending on how much of the stuff in the container is, I'm going to call it tainted, but
Right.
well, at this point, I just want to thank everybody for a lively discussion.
Let's
Thanks,
do this
Richard.
again
That was
next week.
great, Mark.
Yeah, I'm sure things will change by then. But yeah, Jim, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. It was very nice meeting everybody, and thanks so much for the lively dialogue. Really appreciate it.
Happy to do it. And Mark and Richard, if you can send me your slide decks, if you don't mind, and then
Sure.
I'll make those available to everybody that
Great.
attended.
All right.
Interesting discussion, guys. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Everybody.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.